So I have a similar interest in the evidence, impact, value for money on taxpayers' return of investments on the type of things we do. And an area of interest for me is use of social media. And this is social media not only to enhance the value of digital content, which we've been hearing about this morning, but also real-world stuff like the University of Oxford is a real-world thing. It's a tangible thing that we just hear about the wall. So there might be the need to market that organisation. Or this event itself is a real-world thing. So we might say, how might we use the social media in order to understand and appreciate the value of this event? Well, one thing we can do with social media and resources is to make it free. So you'll notice there's a Creative Commons license for this resource. And that was one way of saying, yes, it can be reused. Because I have an interest in the impact, not so much of the digital content, but of ideas. So there's a set of ideas that I will want to have some impact. In addition, these slides themselves are available online. But I'll talk about that briefly. But let's look at this event. So as you can see at the top right, where's the, there it is. There is a hashtag for this event. So it was only coined this morning, so we can see when I last refreshed this, there's been 103 tweets about this. So what might this tell us? So we can see, who's run Coco? Somebody here, right at the back. So doing a lot of tweeting about the event. So a lot of the things that have been spoken about are being retweeted to Run Coco's community. So that's good. We have Mere Ridge is also tweeting here, so we can see the people who are having a role to play in not just learning for these things for themselves, but also being willing to share that more widely. Share that more widely, perhaps across people who are here, but also people who are watching remotely. What else might we see? Who people are referring to, the conversations that are taking place, the hashtags that are being reused, and the tweeted URLs. So we might say the blog post that was mentioned this morning, that has been retweeted, and so that is going beyond just the people here. And it's good to say that your report, which was officially launched this morning to the group here, is also being passed on and retweeted outside our communities. Now, this isn't a significant amount of use of Twitter. I kind of get the feeling that in the digital humanities sector, it hasn't took off as much as it has in, say, the more geeky sectors. So some of the conferences I go to, there'll be several hundred tweets, you know, within the morning. But this is just to give you an indication of how the social media can be used and how we can use metrics in order to analyse this. It's also interesting, the sentiment analysis, very positive. Okay, so that's good. So that was about the event, looking at the social media in this event. I finished my slides yesterday. And when I finished my slides, I wrote a blog post. And I said, I'm going to this event, looking forward to it, this is what it's about, and here's my take. My slides they're not only available on the UKOLN website, they're also available in a social media context. So they're available on SlideShare. So if I click on the SlideShare, we can see that since yesterday there have been 95 views of these slides, and one person has favourited them, and we can go through down here and we can see the person who's favourited them is Ruth Santos, who I don't know, who is based in Peru. So I'm still on slide 1, but I'm having some type of impact. So we can say, what does that say? It's just one person. They made a positive decision to favour this resource. We could also go back to here, and we can see down at the bottom there have been 13 retweets. So I say, here's my blog post. That woman also retweeted it. So she follows me, she saw my tweets, she went and she decided to favourite it. All of that took place because of my use of social media. If it was just my slides on SlideShare, this was just beeping, so Mia has just mentioned me. I think I can look down. But anyway, I better move on to slide 2, haven't I? So anyway, that's the kind of context of this. So yes, you are free to use the slides, video me, record me, tweet me. So for me, this is part of the the openness agenda. So openness is not just about the resources, it can be about the people, their ideas, and the sharing and the like. So social web, personal to institutional use, how the metrics can help us understand the subtle ways in which social media may be used to help us understand trends, and then to say, well, can we relate those analytics to value and ROI, which increasingly we have to do these days, and can we be looking at sets of tools, such as the toolkit we heard about this morning, but also other toolkits, maybe institutional dashboards. So we have lots of opportunities, don't we? So which is relevant? Are any of these relevant? Is the one we should definitely use? Twitter, lots of interest in Twitter, but not necessarily in all cases, as we were hearing from Rowan this morning. And we've also got this new thing. This morning, we were really hearing about institutional approaches to use of digital content. So, you know, the Northern Ireland parliamentary records and the like. But increasingly in the social web, there's a focus on the individual. And this is kind of new. So it's my bookmarks, my Twitter account, and the like. So there are new sets of issues related to this. So I think there's a need to understand these patterns of usage as the social media starts to move on from use by the individual to thinking about how it might be used in an institutional context, and how we might move on to say, let's actually demonstrate some tangible, have some tangible examples of value and ROI. So I think the first thing to do is to look at reflect on one's own personal patterns of usage. I like to think that I saw Twitter in the early days and I used it straight away and I knew it was going to be great and I was an early adopter. But I used the tool to go through and I hardly used it at all for a year. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. Why didn't I? Because nobody else was using it. You just say, I'm standing here in front of a bunch of people and there's no response and there's no banter. So there wasn't a critical mass. So there was about a year sort of before it started to take off. But then I also thought, oh, there's a gap there. I mustn't have used it between March and May 2008. And I thought, hang on, that was when I was at a conference over in the States. That was when I was at the Museums and the Web conference in the States. And that was when I really started to use it. Because it's really useful when you're away at a conference for a few days and you're saying, looking to go out for a drink tonight, anyone fancy going? So it's a new way of meeting people. And I think that was when you first started using it as well. And I know Mia said it was really good in that context. So this helps me to reflect back. We can all, rewrite history and the like, but we have the evidence. And so I can start to say, well, yes, it needs a critical mass. And the other thing I got from that gap was knowing that some of the tools that we use may be flawed. So something went wrong with the harvester, and we need to remember those things. So I'm working on a project on evidence, impact and value, which was looking at these things. We've run 2 workshops so far and got another one coming up. So part of this work was to gather some evidence. So surveys of institutional use of social web services. Who's using them? Who's not using them? How are they being used? What are the patterns of usage? And what are the flaws of the ways of gathering this type of information? So this was looking at Facebook, Twitter, iTunes, maybe a couple of other services across Russell Group universities, which of course includes Oxford. So back in 2007, Facebook announced that organisations could have their own pages. So I thought, oh, this will be kind of interesting. So 3 days later, I did a search for universities. And I think there were 4 from the UK. So these are the leading edge organisations, not what you might expect. And that led on to, why on earth should we be doing it? Facebook is just for individuals. We shouldn't be doing it whatsoever. There were some hardline views back then. You can read the comments on my blog about that back in 2007. 2008, 9 months later, it was an announcement that Facebook was the largest social networking service. So I repeated the survey, and then the Open University was not only had the largest numbers of followers in the UK, had the largest number of all universities around the world. And Aston, which was an early adopter, was second in the list of UK universities. So this was trying to get a feel for the trends over time. So in October 2010, there was an announcement from Facebook to say, you can have your data. It's not locked in. It's no longer so much of a walled garden. And I was thinking, Facebook has kind of liberalised its terms of usage. What's happening now? So another set of follow-up to see how those initial universities had grown. And what we see, largest growth was at Cardiff University. A huge growth in the numbers of users, but typically, 400 to 700% growth, which makes us think, why? What was happening there? There's some changes. It used to be followers, and then it becomes likes. And are we comparing like with like? And what about what's happening with others in the sector besides those early adopters? So January 2011, a survey across Russell Group universities. 5 Russell Group universities did not seem to have a single obvious Facebook presence. And then we saw, oh, look, Oxford and Cambridge were kind of had lots of likes. April, just last month, I repeated this, and now everybody has a presence. Some of them have no content. So it might just be staking the claim to stop others kind of claiming this. But that was what I was doing back then. And then kind of observing those trends was interesting, because I think you might have the geeks don't like Facebook. Facebook is definitely uncool technology. It's closed, there's privacy issues, but marketing people love it. So there are potential conflicts within our institutions. No, we shouldn't be doing it at all. But what we can see here is the evidence of what is actually happening. And this helps us to, what's the success criteria for a Facebook presence? Did Oxford, when they first set it up, say our goal will be by May 2011, we should have 189,000 followers? That for me seems pretty impressive. Coca-Cola have been putting pounds, shillings and pence as values with their followers. Can we do that? Should we do that? So I don't know yet what the approaches may be, but this is kind of where we may be. And then we've got the question about what would be the missed opportunity costs if you failed to engage in this. So it's not just doing it, it's the cost of not doing it or not using it. So that was some of the things about Facebook. Similar survey, 2009, there was a league table. I don't like league tables. It implies there's a one-dimensional hierarchy, but similar. And then in January, I did a survey of the Russell Group universities that we see here. And again, there were a couple of institutions which did not seem to have an obvious institutional presence there. I haven't done the relationship to say maybe if somebody's got Facebook, they decide not to go for Twitter, or the other way around, or perhaps they haven't either, because they think the focus should be on the institutional presence. There might be some ways of observing those type of issues. But here we have the numbers of followers, the numbers that they are following, and the number of tweets that they have published. And then this starts to inform the discussion about the different type of profiles. So obviously the institutions themselves will be very different. We can't compare Oxford with University of Poppleton or whatever, so there will be understandable differences. But what we can start to see are different ways in which these things are being used. Does your university follow other people so you can respond to them? Or does it just say, no, we're a broadcast medium? And those different profiles are taking place, of usage are taking place. iTunes, it was actually not so easy. We heard about iTunes this morning from Rowan. Not so easy to get the statistics to compare across the different users. So what I did was to look at what the 17, I think it was, 10 universities that I found, about what they were saying their usage were. And again, we were seeing different set of emphases. Oxford were talking about the numbers, We actually heard that this morning in Rowan's, very, very macho. Whereas others were talking about the range of the coverage of their content, or the fact that it was for free. And of course, we know from the Vice-Chancellor at the Open University, who was saying that those people who download content for free sometimes sign up to do a course. So that might be the loss leader which attracts people to sign up for the university. YouTube did provide us with more sets of statistics. So these were the statistics, again, for the institutions that had an official YouTube account. And what we could say, what we could speculate, is that there'll be a community which will be wrapped around that video of the spires and the like, and the nice, pretty place. But we don't actually get that. So we can say the view that you might have a community of people talking about the videos doesn't appear to be the case. We're not getting comments based around that. So this can help, again, inform our understanding of these things. So I wrote blog posts about all of those things, my speculation, my thoughts, and there was various discussions about helping to understand the sector, to understand the best practices. Should you have a geolocation for your Twitter account? You might say, no, the university doesn't move. But if somebody's visiting it and there's a concert on just down the road last night and show me things that are happening nearby here, there might be a role to play. But actually that's not happening at the moment. Geolocation isn't taking place for institutional Twitter accounts. So we might say, maybe should it be or not? So, but I would say there are potential problems if we try and build up a league table. You know, the purposes are different, institutions different, and the like. But we do need to do this. And why do we need to do this? Well, it's the current, not only economic situation, but also the political situation. So in April, the Daily Telegraph published an article, universities spending millions on websites which students rate as inadequate. You know, this came out, and this caused a lot of university web managers a lot of panic. So I wrote a blog post. They said, typical university website costs £60,000 per year to maintain. And my blog post said, wow, that's cheap. And there was other comments about, well, actually it is. And there was one argument, Ranjit Sidhu, which was talking about the flaws in that methodology, and based on some approaches he would take, and that a website can bring in £1 million to £5 million in applications, you know, and the like, and that's actually a good thing. So I think Eric mentioned this morning. We can't not do this, because if we fail to make use of the metrics, the Daily Telegraphs of the world will use this information, and they might not be as sympathetic to our cause as we might hope to think. So around the time all of this was happening, last year at UKOLN's Institutional Web Management Workshop, there was the talk about the need for universities to be able to understand the impact and value, potentially financial value, of their institutional web presences. And Ranjit Sidhu, who's a consultant, has developed an institutional benchmark approach. So as consultants will go to the universities and say, what's it you're trying to attract? And it might be, we heard this morning about Chinese students, popularity of iTunes U in China. It might be, yeah, we want to attract students from China, this particular demographics, this particular area of interest. How do we measure that? And if we can get them, this relates to so much income. So this is the type of dashboard approach that is being developed. So opportunities and concerns. So I think we do need to engage with this type of thing. But there's problems about comparisons with one's peers and what happens if you're not being seen to do as well. But there can also be benefits about that openness. And if you're not doing so well, you can learn from other people. And we need to remember that it might be difficult for us to hide the data because of FOI. Some of you may know Tony Hurst, who's a great mashup maestro based at the Open University. He sent an FOI request to Bath University saying, can you give me your stats made to Sconal about use of... And so this is published, this is openly available, which says, yeah, 418,000 on electronic resources. It's going to happen in any case. So let's take responsibility and be proactive for doing this ourselves, I would suggest. So if we are going to do this, we do need to do this. I would say let's start using some of these tools. So, and we might say tools like Twitter can be useful because of their virality. And a year ago, does anybody remember the Daily Mail racist poll? Nope. So it was going around Twitter, should NHS allow gypsies to jump to the front of the queue? And guess what? We spotted that and we joined in the poll. And 96% of people said yes. And guess what happened the next day? This had disappeared from the Daily Mail website. There's no record. But I captured a screen image of this. It was only 94%. But that illustrates the way in which a group of people, it might be us lefties, were working in some subversive way in order, you know, there's these type of things. But that's kind of an illustration of that virality can type of help, and we can start to look at the evidence, visits to links, and the like. And one of the things is, if you don't register with some of these analytics, you'll miss out on, you know, the early history and the successes if things grow, or the way things changed. And we can apply these things to blog metrics as well. So Technorati, it's not particularly fashionable these days, but it's a tool that looks at the blogosphere, and they have various rankings. So Cambridge University use a blog to create their news feed, which has an RSS feed, and they've registered with Technorati, and they're in the top 0.04% of all blogs. I think it is. So there's some evidence that they can use. Do a search. Go to Technorati and do a search for JISC. There are 5 blogs that have significant authority, and one is Mashi, Martin Hawksey, at the RSC Scotland's North and East, I think it is. And so here are some examples. So I'm pleased that my blog, Oswatch blog, JISC Access Management blog, and the Mashi blog are kind of there with this ranking. So we can actually learn from this. We can actually say what we're doing, how we're doing it, and if JISC requires some evidence about the effectiveness of our blogs, we can start to use these type of things. We might say, well, that particular service might be flawed. Let's use another service as well. So this is Wikio, and this is where it's nice to see Tony Hurst's blog, my blog, and Martin Weller blog are listed in the top 60 of technology blogs. Now, and we've got some stats over monthly shape. So what might we say this? How could we use this type of information? So it might be, who's number 53 and 54, and how much investment do they put in? If we're kind of around the same location as some of those big national, you know, the Guardian online blog and the like, we might be able to use that in some way to say our investment has the equivalent from this, from other sectors. And I know it's a simplistic approach, so this is the Pollardian yeah but no but yeah but. So not all blogs are meant to be mass market, so those metrics are based around comments to the blog. So it might be if you're a news blog, it's just one way, you don't expect people to comment on it. That's fair, I would agree. But sometimes they are intended to encourage debate and the like. The trends might be useful, all of these type of things. And we do search engine optimization. So I think increasingly we'll need to do the social media optimization as well. So what's missing? Well, I've talked about metrics and comparisons with peers and trends analysis and the virality, but not so much about the qualitative feedback, the contextual type of issues, the snapping that usage and communities to actually outputs and outcomes, and some of the ethical aspects of social media optimization. I'll link to you if you link to me. Let's put our links in Wikipedia with typos, and so every time it's edited we get lots of links. You know, no, you shouldn't do that. So there are those type of things. But I'll just conclude with something that came across. It was just 2 weeks ago. We got an email. A colleague got an email from Neil Grinley in the JISC to say, could you provide me with some evidence of the impact of take-up of the JISC Preservation of Web Resources project? And we go, yeah, we've gathered some statistics, we got some feedback from the forums, we got, you know, this, that and the other, and then we said, well, we need some, it'd be nice to have some numbers as well as these sort of nice sayings. So we went, there was a paper that was presented about the project at the IPRES conference in 2008. We've evidence for the stats in our institutional repository, but also the slides were on SlideShare, and what we had from there was 1,911 views and 2 favourites. So we could use that. I wrote a blog post about how social media can act as a magnet for not only gathering the numbers, but also the comments as well. So I wrote a blog post, I tweeted about the blog post, that was retweeted by people I know in Holland, who said, ah yes, one of the people who used this work, they knew over in Holland, and they responded on the blog post. I used the project outcomes not only to get my arguments about why websites should be archived straight, but also to show the webmaster of my organisation what needs to be done. Eventually they started preserving our website by contracting a third-party service. So this was the guy who embedded these slides in his blog post. So that was being able to, you know, follow up and get something like this as the evidence of the impact of the take-up of our resource. And so I will finish there by saying I think we should be willing to be more proactive about collecting the data, particularly data that may disappear, may not exist if we don't do it. It can help to inform our understanding of our services, make comparisons with our peers, and to be used by others, perhaps to demonstrate the value and to respond to the wider mass media. So, thank you. Next.
Said it for me. Any questions or comments? And just a reminder that we are recording these sessions, so if you don't want your question recorded, just don't take the mic from me when I run towards you. Questions? Goodness me. So that was a resounding success. You've explained everything. Okay, in that case, thank you very much to Brian Kelly for a really thought-provoking talk. I've already decided to do lots of new measures of our impact.
Is it me next, or is it?
Yes. So in that case, I'll turn to Jane Winters, who's here from the Institute of Historical Research in the University of London, where she's head of publications and head of IHR Digital. And she's going to talk to us about taking the long view with digital impact.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be talking a bit about scholarly impact, and particularly over longer timeframes than some of the things that we've been hearing about this morning. Anyone working in the digital field knows that if you can rely on nothing else, you can rely on the ferocious pace of change. Technologies and methodologies are constantly developing and evolving, and it's impossible to predict which new research or social media tool might be engaging us all this time next year. However, when it comes to measuring the impact of digital resources and tools, we've ground to something of a halt. We've known for a long time that we are not effectively evaluating our digital outputs and their impact on research, teaching and learning, but it is only very recently that the problem has begun to be tackled in any systematic fashion. Today I'm going to be talking about 2 projects which have sought to address questions of the impact of digital resources over the last decade or so. Oops. First, in 2005, which is almost lost in the mists of time in digital terms, the Institute of Historical Research was funded by the AHRC to produce a report on the peer review and evaluation of digital resources for the arts and humanities. The premise of the project was that, while the mechanisms for judging the merit of traditional print outputs of scholarly research were very well established, no equivalent then existed for assessing the value of digital resources and the work which leads to their creation. The ultimate aim was to develop a consistently applied system of peer review of both the intellectual content and the technical architecture of digital resources, which would serve to reassure academics, their host institutions and funding bodies that time spent in their creation was time well spent. Such a system or process would help to establish those types of resource which are of most use and interest to the academic community, contribute to the development of common standards and guidelines for accessibility and usability, and inform proposals to ensure the sustainability and preservation of high-quality scholarly material. A widespread consultation exercise was undertaken as part of the project, including the usual online survey with almost 800 responses, a number of focus groups convened around the country, and interviews with key stakeholders in the fields of history, archaeology, information services, and digital humanities, which was then very definitely humanities computing rather than digital humanities. The final project report made 19 recommendations. Some of them related specifically to the AHRC's own peer review strategies and are not as such relevance here, but the majority were designed to be broadly applicable, and many of them will sound depressingly familiar 6 years on. Something which came up time and time again in discussion was the general lack of confidence among digital practitioners in the ability of the existing pool of peer reviewers to evaluate their work effectively and in its totality. This was in large part a symptom of the much discussed skills gap, which was perceived as hindering researchers both from exploiting digital resources to their fullest extent and, crucially, from assessing their value. This problem has not gone away, as evinced by the very real need for programmes addressing digital literacies, such as the recent JISC 411 call. It is not just, or at least not always, sour grapes when researchers complain that peer reviewers have failed to understand what they are trying to do, or have not grasped the possibilities and complexities of a particular resource. We recommended that there should be greater investment in the training of researchers to evaluate and use digital resources, and that university libraries and information services departments should be encouraged to provide training to mid and late career academics as well as to new researchers. And I think there's still a concentration on the new researchers, which is neglecting people who are more established. There are now many examples of good practice around, but it's not yet embedded across the sector. We've got a long way to go. One approach recommended by the project was the development of guidelines for potential reviewers, providing general advice about those elements of digital projects which should be considered in evaluation. Draft guidelines were indeed published as an appendix to the final report, proposing that reviewers might focus on content, usability, the added value of digital over print delivery, technical standards, presentation, authority, and audience. The intention was not to be prescriptive, but to demystify the process and encourage academics to view digital research as mainstream scholarship. Turning to the evaluation process itself, it was clear that digital resources were not well served by review at a single point in their life cycle. Effective evaluation is a constant and iterative process in a way that is simply not true for printed research outputs. Some of the traditional forms of assessment are still useful in this context, most notably reviews in scholarly journals. The report recommended that journal editors should be encouraged routinely to commission such reviews for publication, alongside those of monographs and collected essays. There has been some progress here. In light of the report's findings, we changed the editorial policy of our own online reviews journal, Reviews in History, and began to publish lengthy treatments of major digital resources, both subscription only and freely available. Also in the field of history, as distinguished journal's English Historical Review has begun to publish short pieces assessing the academic merit of digital resources. A recent review of the IHR's Making History project, however, highlights a couple of problems. Most strikingly, and indicating quite how far we do still have to go, the URL for the resource is never mentioned. So if anyone is intrigued by the review, they have no easy way of going directly to the resource. The reviewer also concludes that making history at the moment is a good idea, but one that still needs filling out. Since it is online, however, deficiencies can easily be repaired. And of course they can't. This was a one-year project with no possibility of further funding. So expectations need to be managed in relation to what reviewers are expecting to find. One way of avoiding issues like this is for any review and evaluation process to be opened up, with reviewers identified and engaging in dialogue with resource creators. Then the status of a digital resource may be easily established, and those elements which are susceptible to change identified. The fact that a resource is about to undergo a major upgrade may be incorporated into a reviewer's thinking, or indeed the evaluation delayed to take account of such developments. Reviews in History operates an author's right of reply, which goes some way to encouraging this kind of dialogue. The option isn't always taken up, but the results can be instructive and go to the heart of the impact of a particular resource. This was true, for example, of the review of the First World War Poetry Archive and Great War Archive here at Oxford, which saw a lively discussion about the use of Flickr to continue the project once its initial funding had run out. Informed reviewing of this kind draws out the impact of digital resources in scholarly and technical terms, and simultaneously contributes to that impact by introducing new projects and approaches to a wider audience. Another traditional method of measuring value and impact is, as you heard from Eric this morning, citation. We proposed that common and widely publicised citation standards for digital resources should be established, and that resource creators should be encouraged both to include citation advice on their project websites and to maintain permanent URLs. It is striking how little progress has been made in this area, and the failure to address the problem, again as you heard this morning, has led to significant masking of the impact of digital resources on research practice. An unacceptably large number of digital resources either fail to provide any citation information or produce URLs in a form which is more or less unusable. Researchers in the humanities are simply not referencing the digital, but this cannot entirely be placed at the door of resource creators. For example, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography offers exemplary citation guidance. For each biography, users are offered 4 different citation options, which may easily be copied and pasted into a research article. With another hat on, I edit the IHR's journal, Historical Research, and I would say that about half of the references to the ODNB in articles that we publish are initially still to the print volumes. Needless to say, when this is followed up with authors, it is almost always the case that the printed version has not in fact played any role in their research at all. Perhaps of even more concern is the fact that we have never published an article which references early English books online, and that despite early modern history being one of the strengths of the journal. It perhaps becomes less surprising when you look at the type of durable URL with which researchers are presented. When you look at that, you can see that there is no way of connecting that URL with the original resource that people are citing. So people still cite the book rather than the URL. And that came up in discussion, that anybody seeing the URL on its own should know what it's referring to and be able to trace back. And that comes back to the cool URIs that you were mentioning this morning. Despite this, though, there's still no real excuse for failing to mention an introductory footnote, for example, that unless otherwise mentioned, all cited texts have been consulted via EBO. Anecdotally, we know that EBO has transformed research in this area. You hear people talking about the EBO thesis, for example, research that just wouldn't have been possible without it. But you would be looking through the literature for a long time before you found measurable evidence of that impact. As in the case of citation, where resource creators may sometimes be their own worst enemies, the report also identified the failure of many digital projects properly to document their processes and decision-making as a significant barrier to usage, to assessment, and ultimately to impact. Many digital projects have taken this message on board, and as with citation, evidence of excellent practice is readily to hand. London Lives, for example, includes in its About This Project section information on the project's rationale, the choice of sources, technical methods, encompassing rekeying, markup, digitisation, the search engine used, and even website design, and a section of information specifically for academic researchers. This transparency, including a frank admission of any weaknesses, allows for much more effective assessment of the site's value to the research community. In 2005-06, when we were doing that project, metrics were beginning to loom large in the humanities, and as you might expect, this was particularly the case with regard to digital resources. One type of usage could, it seemed, be measured easily, although perhaps easily really shouldn't be ever used in relation to web statistics. The creators of digital resources were certainly starting to feel the pressure to deliver numbers. There was broad agreement among those whom we consulted that they should of course work to ensure the widest possible dissemination for their project outputs, but that the inability to attract a large audience was not in itself evidence of failure. It was important to distinguish between those resources which might have a profoundly transformative effect on only a small group of researchers. Consequently, the report recommended that levels of usage should not be used as a key indicator of the scholarly value or even impact of a digital resource, but as one element of a much more complex process, which might have more or less significance for different types of project. Similarly, there was a blunt rejection of any sort of kite marking system, despite the passionate advocacy of a significant minority of those whom we consulted. The combination of quantitative and qualitative indicators deployed by TIDSA seems to me to be exemplary in this respect. The second project I'd like to talk about today is a longitudinal study undertaken by the IHR to assess the impact of digital resources on historians' research behaviour. With funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, we revisited a group of researchers and research projects at intervals in 2002, 2005, 2009 and 2011 to identify where genuine transformation was occurring, where traditional methods and processes were slowly evolving, and where there had in fact been little or no change at all. And again, the speed of change has been rather slower than anticipated at the beginning of the 21st century. Change, however, there has certainly been. For historians, the large-scale digitisation of the past decade and more has supported research which would otherwise have been impossible, if not in some cases inconceivable. It has also altered the research process itself in what might seem minor ways, but which collectively add up to a substantial evolution. Our study revealed that researchers are much more likely to spend time searching out minor and scattered references in an online environment than when dealing with printed or archival material. The boundary between core and tangential resources has become considerably fuzzier, and greater levels of contextual and illustrative detail are readily available. There has also been a reordering of the research process into something much less linear. The traditional form of the history PhD, involving months of concentrated archival research in the initial stages, often determined by constraints of access and location, has largely been replaced by simultaneous research and writing up, with checking and addition possible to a very late stage in the cycle. This is, of course, a generalisation, and there are exceptions. The same study, for example, also showed that many researchers are still unlikely to search speculatively for core primary and secondary sources online. They will use the material about which they already know, but not check, for example, whether a particular text or collection of material has been digitised in the last 6 months. This has interesting implications for new projects trying to make themselves visible in an already crowded landscape. A huge amount of work is needed to bring a resource to the attention of its target audience, and that means communicating with researchers in the contexts and environments within which they are used to working, rather than expecting them to come to you. Lorna mentioned the if you build it, they will come approach that marked the early stages of digital research. Publishers tend to understand and do this very well, but projects within higher education are frequently less successful, often for very good reasons, such as lack of funding or the departure of a project team at the end of a research grant. Recent and ongoing work to bring existing resources together, notably through the clustering and enhancing strand of JISC's e-content programme, is helping to tackle this problem. But it remains important to present digital resources to researchers in familiar settings, notably library catalogues and resource centres, and to raise awareness through well-used services such as Google Scholar. Despite this caveat, the ways in which historians retrieve and process information have developed significantly in the digital environment, in terms of scale and speed, but also in subtler and perhaps ultimately more important ways. This might all seem rather prosaic in terms of impact, but it's a major and necessary step towards more radical change, that is, identifying the genuinely new research questions and methodologies that we heard about this morning. While some of these advances are applicable to historians generally and to scholars in many other humanities disciplines as well, it's important to recognise that the pace of change has not been uniform. There are wide variations in the extent to which digital resources have influenced researcher behaviour, in large part a result of the focus of investment in digitisation in particular. It is early modern historians who have perhaps inevitably reaped the greatest rewards. My colleague Tom Hitchcock has said that early modern London is the most digitised time and place in history, and for many historians of this period, the vast majority of sources which they will need to consult are readily available online. Critical mass has been reached elsewhere too. For example, in the provision of 17th to 19th century newspapers by the British Library, in the material for parliamentary history published by ProQuest and British History Online, and in Cengage's early English books online. Our study has shown that the availability of major corporate and digital form is the single most important factor in historians' awareness of and readiness to engage with digital resources and tools more widely. Comprehensiveness and impact are fairly closely aligned in some fields. In some fields, relatively early digitisation has meant that digital resources have now become a fixture of the research process. and it is in these areas that more innovative work, such as data and text mining, is most well developed. For the poor historian of the 20th century, where digital activity has been hobbled by copyright concerns and by the sheer scale of the material involved, the position is rather different. Comprehensiveness is harder, if not impossible, to achieve for this period, and this should be borne in mind when assessing the usage and impact of digital resources. The assumption that the material is more accessible, for example, because it's not in medieval Latin, really doesn't hold true for a lot of the resources for the 20th century. Many of these questions are beginning to be unpicked by the British Library's excellent Researchers of Tomorrow study, supported by JISC, and it is to be hoped that it will continue beyond the initial 3 years of funding. Much of the OUCS research in this area, and the peer review report in particular, predates the explosion of social media tools and techniques that Brian's just been talking about, that we've witnessed in the past couple of years. It would be instructive to revisit the project in the light of recent initiatives, such as the Shakespeare Quarterly Open Peer Review Experiment. We also aim to continue our longitudinal study, which has now been extended to a wider group of researchers than the initial survey. If we are to make the case for investment in digital resources for the arts and humanities, then it is vital to take the long view and to demonstrate that impact happens over time and often in entirely unexpected ways. Individual projects have a responsibility to do some of this work themselves. The Henry III Fine Rolls project at King's College London is a good example of precisely this. Its news section presents every occasion on which the project was presented at a conference or workshop, every mention in a newspaper, journal or magazine, any link that's set up since the project started in 2005. And it's simple enough to do, but it's still very unusual. The tools to help are now out there, as has been so admirably demonstrated this morning. There is also an important role for funding bodies and learned and subject societies to promote and support best practice and to provide a focus for quality at the discipline and national level. It's not an easy or cheap process, but it's essential that we engage with it seriously. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jane, for a really informative paper. I'm sure there are lots of questions. Hands up if you've got one. You're all so silent this afternoon.
Available for download or anywhere?
It will be, yes, I'll put it in our e-repository.
Thank you very much. And you'll circulate the details, will you?
I will. Well, I have a question, Jane, if you don't mind. So you showed the British Library newspapers there, yes, and said that there's broad coverage for some subject areas. Yeah. How much awareness do you think there is that, for example, the newspaper project is a sort of tip, the digital part is a tip of the iceberg? Yeah. Should we be worried that with some coverage being so comprehensive, there'll be an assumption that all coverage is similar?
I think that really is a big problem, and even within something like the newspapers, as you say, there are still large sections that haven't been dealt with yet. Yeah. And it does shape the way research is done. As I mentioned, the EBO thesis earlier means that anything that's not in EBO is going to be relatively neglected, and you hear anecdotal evidence of supervisors pointing their students at research projects that they can do online. So I think we do need to raise awareness of the limitations that are there, and that it's still worth going to the archives, I think. John Morrell's just reviewed in History Today a new book about Cromwell, and his whole point was that it's fantastic to see somebody going back to the archives and finding something that nobody else knew about, rather than, he called it the sort of quick and easy approach to research by doing keyword searching in something like British History Online and EBO. So that it's there isn't a dichotomy, but people do need to be more aware that there are still things that aren't digitised and won't ever be digitised.
Yeah. Great. Anyone else got a question? Great.
Hi, you might need to open your slide again.
Oh, sorry.
On page 6. Okay. At the bottom there it says impact factor. I was wondering what that was.
Oh, it's a journal thing. It's for the citation indices. Each journal. It's mostly social sciences journals, actually. There aren't many humanities journals that do it. It's an algorithm for based on citation that gives a sort of journal ranking system. So that the higher your impact factor, the more, in theory, that journal is valued by the community. Although it tends to favour the big generalist journals rather than the more niche society journals.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay.
I wondered what you thought made a good URL for citing, whether the key is short or the key is human readable. I know both is ideal, but it's, in order to provide unique URIs, not always practicable.
It probably depends who you're talking to. I think journal editors want something short because you don't want, an article to take up 3 extra pages because it's got great long URLs. But the thing that researchers kept saying is that you need to be able to see the URL in isolation and be able to work out what the original non-digital source was from that information. So the human readable is very, very important for researchers. And it gets around some of the durability questions as well, because say that site disappears, you can still find out where that came from originally.
I mean, this is in a sense a follow-up to that, but it's really a question more to the people from JISC here. That I'm aware that our site, for example, we've tried to make our URLs sensible, but they still refer to technology. I mean, they're all .jsp. And an awful lot of sites, they're sort of giving away the underlying technology. But we've never been under any pressure to do anything about that. And I mean, that's true of a great many academic sites. Their URLs, the more you know about web technology, the less confident you are that they're persistent, in fact.
I was just going to make a follow-up point that it's quite easy in technical terms to provide human-readable URLs for resources. So a page, an item in an archive. It's quite hard to provide URLs for facts, as in there were 26 results for this. There are 7 recorded instances of this happening. And I haven't seen anyone do that terribly well, and I wondered if there was any good practice on this.
I think you're absolutely right that it's very difficult to cite that sort of information, and particularly where it's going to change over time. If your whole thesis is that this particular term appears X number of times in a resource, but they either tidy up the OCR or do whatever, and that result changes, it's a difficult question, and I'm not sure that we're really engaging with it very well. There may be examples that I don't know about, but I think we're not engaging with that terribly well.
I'll come at this from a slightly different perspective from other areas in terms of preservation. Do handle URLs or locks as a service not register in this sort of area? I don't know, feel free to say if that doesn't mean anything to you.
It does, yes.
Oh, okay.
No, I mean, if people still won't even cite the thing that they're using, they're not going to be aware of services like locks. They're not going to use it. And DOIs, yes, if it's going through a major publisher, that's fine. They'll have a DOI, but you can't afford to be part of that if you're a smaller publisher or working independently. So I think the awareness level generally about that sort of thing is very low among humanities researchers. And as I said, it's partly our fault for not explaining it properly to them.
No, I was thinking more about, if you say about sites vanishing or URLs no longer working, because obviously the journal is going to last longer than a lot of websites just due to the nature of that fact.
Yeah.
It seems to be quite a, well, to have a URL last for a long time wouldn't seem to be that hard a problem to solve as long as you had a central service that could redirect or something like that.
Let me just mention, there's a whole other community of people, the web archiving community. I was just speaking at the IIPC, which is the International Internet Preservation Consortium, last week or 2 weeks ago. And they're thinking about these very issues, which is a lot of the web is being archived. But most people don't know where to go to find the old pages. There's the Wayback Machine that the Internet Archive has, that some of you may be familiar with. But there are a lot of people building new tools that will let you more seamlessly have 404 pages, for instance, redirect automatically into something like the Internet Archive, so that the old version of that page can become visible to you, and it'll be clear that this is an old version of the page, not a live version. So there's other communities working on these very same things, which is how to make the old web, much of which isn't gone forever. It's stored on various computers here and there and other places, to make that more visible to people looking for the information, so they can find things that have since apparently disappeared from the web, but actually do still exist in other forms.
If that message can be got out to researchers easily, I think that'll get around a lot of the reluctance to...
If you poke around my SSRN page, there's another report on there, if you'd like to comment on it, called Web Archives of the Future, that's open for comment for the next few weeks. If you have thoughts on this area, I'd welcome those on that report as well, because that's going out to the web archiving community to connect them with what the researchers do.
I think better leave that there for now, but we can come back to all of these questions in the roundtable discussion at the end of the day. But for now, let's just thank Jane again very much.
So I am talking about the Oxford Podcasts project, which has been name-checked several times. And that, I suppose, is part of the project, is that it brought us a lot of publicity and a lot of people have seen it and a lot of people have opinions on it. So that's kind of part and parcel to the impact that it's had. And the question that Eric proposed for this seminar, the workshop today, was around understanding the usage and impact, because significant investment goes into the creation of these resources. And I think you'll know by the sort of scale of the stuff that is in the Oxford Podcasts collection, there's been a lot of investment and investment in that and in the infrastructure that supports it. And so increasingly we need to be able to show what the impact of that was. It's something that lots of people refer to, but it was kind of hard to convince the university to start with, but it's generally considered to be a good thing. It's bringing us lots of very good publicity. So it's since 2008 we've been putting material up into iTunes U, and we took an institutional approach to this. So when Brian talks about institutions making use of social media, for anybody who knows Oxford, the idea that there's a single institution here is, well, it would be hard to say who tweets for Oxford or who blogs for Oxford or whatever. So even having an Oxford on iTunes U, there's something there which does allow us to have a single channel up, but of course all of the material is drawn from across the institution. And that's quite important, that material belongs to all of the colleges and all of the departments and all of the individuals who create it, not to the institution as such, but it's difficult to take an institutional approach to things here. So this is, of course, what I'm talking about if you haven't seen it. It's mobile content that can be downloaded onto your iPod or listened to you on your machine. It's available through iTunes. It's also available on the web. And Rowan was alluding to how difficult that makes it for us to actually track anything like downloads and metrics. But part of the project, the Listening for Impact, was to try to get some way to understanding the kind of numbers that went with this activity. But of course, because, again, the material is available in iTunes, it's available on the OUCS website, podcasts, but it's also on all the colleges' homepages and the individual academics' homepages and the departments' homepages. So where to track that material from is very challenging. And in each of those situations, the material has different impact because of the different context in which it's being used. But that's what makes this so interesting, is that the technology has made it possible to put what is essentially a single recording in so many different places at once. And so the technology itself has the impact of being able to make this possible. So the contributors are generally professors, heads of departments, visiting high-profile speakers, but also anybody else who just wants to get their recording out there. We don't make we don't vet material. It's all volunteered and given freely. Anyone across the institution who wants to put material up is part of this collection. We have a couple thousand assets, and the estimates on how many downloads we have vary in millions, but there's certainly some millions. So the project was really to work with academic colleagues to freely share their resources on the web. And the aim is to provide inspirational and aspirational content. And there's free and there's public, and they're not all the same. And all of our content that's in the Oxford collection is free. It's all available to the public. And some of it is licensed more openly than that. So it's licensed as open educational resources. And there's a mention from Humble. I think you understand what open educational resources are. So particularly the openly licensed stuff is available for use, revision, translation, improvement, and sharing with anyone who wants to use it. So the material can go on and have a life of its own in new homes. And where it gets taken from there It's almost as though the openness of the material makes it even more difficult to track its impact, because it goes off and lives in other places perfectly happily, being used by other educators. So the attempt to find out where it's gone and what it's doing and what people are doing with it is part of the challenge that certainly is addressing the OER strands of JISC projects. But I've been thinking about the impact of the activity as well as the content. So the impact of the activity of doing this internally and externally, the impact of the content internally and externally, and the impact on people and practice, because it's also, this is an institution where teaching and research are so combined, that the technology should be supporting both of those. And that's really the reason why I do it, not the reason I drink particularly, but the reason why I do this is really about, from a career in learning technology, how you get academics to make use of technology in their learning and teaching. And people suggested to me before I came to Oxford that Oxford academics would in some way not be interested in making use of technology, which I think we've proved isn't the case. What's interesting is where you get a technology that is serving both the learning and the teaching and is active in that space, that the material that academics at Oxford use in their teaching is the material where they are talking about their research. So this is a very exciting learning technology project for me. So the impact in terms of learning technology and the number of people who are making teaching materials available is, I think, quite significant for the institution. So the success of podcasting is one of those tipping points where you bring a technology and a group of people together at the right time, and the enthusiasm for it just spreads like wildfire. And actually, well, the success is for a number of reasons, but part of it, I think, is probably just the timing together of people knew enough about what podcasts were, and there was enough of that going on. iTunes arrived at just the right time, and the idea of recording your material seemed to fit. And we are talking global reach for the material, and institutional showcasing within that. I think it's, that's definitely a big part of what this is. And with Apple, you have two big global brands working together. We also have the Public Affairs Directorate, PAD, who are the publicity machine behind Oxford, and they're working with us as well. So again, in terms of marketing and outreach and impact, this is very much a partnership of lots of different groups. And as Rowan alluded to, again, sometimes it surprises us the things that Apple choose to market. It's a bit of a mystery as to sometimes what they choose, but we're not complaining, because certainly when they do choose to market or highlight something, we see huge peaks in the downloads. In terms of the value of the assets and what makes an asset particularly valuable, what makes a collection valuable, I probably don't have to rehearse generally the sort of business models around how having collections available are assets to your institution. There's definitely something about promoting your brand, which is very, very valuable, and Oxford, as has been alluded to, is a very valuable brand. There's definitely something about reputation and the material. Oxford's business we're a content creation organisation. We do research, and we're interested in making that knowledge available on a global scale. And we want to attract the best staff and the best students to our organisation. So if this collection is doing any of that for us, it's already of great value and worth investing in. It's also true that the students who come to Oxford have an expectation of being able to browse everything. You can find everything that's ever been published in the Bodleian. So the expectation of being able to follow individual lines of inquiry, and the purpose of an Oxford lecture, of course, is to send you to the library to do further research. So the collection of Oxford podcasts allows the students to browse around inside those. Someone cynical might say that doing a project like this gives a perception of openness to a traditionally very closed institution. But I think that there's a value in having that perception of openness, which actually does have great value to the institution, and that sort of idea of it being accessible, that people can now see what goes on in Oxford and listen to it, which I think is very striking. And the admissions team at Oxford have won awards to do with their use of podcasts, particularly to try to demystify the process of coming to Oxford. There's also something about giving and the public good, and somebody was mentioning about media coverage. And to me, I find it very heartening that a lot of the media coverage that we get, we're mentioned. I always look to see who else is mentioned in the same article, and we're always being mentioned in conjunction with MIT, Cambridge, obviously, who we benchmark against, but also Open University, which because of this activity, and Open University and Oxford University, I would say, are very different businesses, but there's something about being open and giving things away. So as well as individual showcasing and bringing us into new markets, I think the value of the material that is being given, particularly when it's Creative Commons licensed by the academic, you're talking intellectual property there, and when they decide to give material away for other people to use for the greater good of the world, that's a big gift. And that has quite high value. It is no small thing that is being given, and they're saying that they're prepared to give material away. So even though it might be a small market of key people rather than millions of downloads, it's a valuable thing that is being given. I don't think we're quite at the point where academics will be perhaps giving away, tithing 10% of their academic output each year, but I think we're in a position where people are making a decision to give away some part of their material quite openly. So in terms of the impact of having this kind of activity going on, the numbers of people, so 400 people who are speakers at Oxford have signed Creative Commons license to give parts of their material away, and that's a significant impact just by the nature of having the project. It's also true that when we're defining value and impact, we need to look at the use of the resources, and the Listening for Impact project was partly to try to find metrics around that. Some of our project funding came under the, as I say, the OER strand, and so there's a requirement, a keenness to show evidence of reuse of material. Certainly it's a big investment in the legal side to get material licensed for reuse, and so we'd like to see some evidence of that. Obviously within the institution, I can give you multiple examples of the same thing being used in lots of different places, in the virtual learning environment, out on the web, by the college, by the department. Does that count as reuse even within different contexts within the same institution? We also see, people downloading stuff from all over the world, so they are using it in a different context. The openness with which we publish it makes it harder to count what goes on with it, and also the suggestion that if stuff isn't being remixed and tailored and chopped and changed, that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't valuable for reuse. It means that, I think it means that just as it is, it makes it a perfect little asset. It's exactly what it says it is, and you can reuse it without having to change it particularly. So it actually has very high value. We have had some impact on our neighbours, which I think is significant from this area of activity. The number of visitors that we have who come to Oxford University Computing Services to find out how to get into iTunes, how to do it, how we persuaded academics to do it, what kind of work we're doing here. So we have lots of visitors, and I think that people see what we're doing. We have particular projects as well with our neighbours, Oxford Brookes and Harper Adams universities, particularly to sort of cascade ideas about this area of work. So somebody was asking earlier about partnerships, and we're doing a sort of cascade partnership with some of our immediate neighbours. So impact on practice internally, learning and teaching practice. The biggest impact, I would say, for the staff in the institution is a general raising awareness of what it means to have your material online as a content creator. I think we've made a huge shift in 2 years. Also an understanding of the license under which material has been made available, because there's a sign-off process. And so there's a level of making informed decisions about where your material goes, which could be digital literacy. It's also about how they can make best use of their content for impact and outreach, and open ways of working. So this is, a real change in the approach, particularly around learning technology, that it is that recording your stuff or using new media or putting it onto the web doesn't seem like an unusual thing to do anymore. It also has meant that we've met many more academics around the institution who we can now get to put their material into the virtual learning environment and use it for teaching on campus. As a result of the Listening for Impact project, I think we're now more able to provide to individual academics, perhaps, an objective analysis of how popular their material might be, or how they could make their material more popular, from tracking what kind of things gets a lot of downloads and where those downloads are. And so, when academics are filling in the impact statement in a research project application, we can make some guesses as to, if you produce a podcast and you put it in these places, you are likely to see this kind of level of download and impact, subject to the whims of Apple marketing. But so this kind of case studies of impact, and I think that we're going to get better and better at that, and that kind of information is the kind of information that you have your early adopters using technology who will do it anyway and give it a go. But the evidence of impact in the case studies is the kind of persuasive information that gets you into a larger majority of people. And that's certainly what's keeping me awake at night, is the worry that more people will want to try to do this. And in fact, if everybody across the institution wanted to do this, we would be struggling for the sustainability. So there's an impact in knowing your impact, which is that everybody might want to do it. So maybe we should have just kept a bit quieter about it. I think there's an impact on academic practice generally, but it's because the academics that we're talking about are making disseminating their research in these podcasts, but they're also people who publish, of course, and the material is often very linked. And I think that there's a place there which is the intersection of this open release of educational content and podcasts, and the open release of open publishing and open books, perhaps. And I think that's worth revisiting. And you'll know that Alice said, "What's the use of a book without pictures or conversations?" And we're definitely seeing that podcasts and the being very findable, discoverable on the web in your podcast is driving hits through to where book sales and such are going on. But whether those same people who are making the decision to release material openly in podcasts are also making decisions to release other shapes of their research, other aspects of their research openly, I'm not sure, but there's a direction of travel there, which is worth looking at, because a lot of this is about showcasing and personal benefits in terms of reputation. If you're not going to make your millions from your book, you might prefer to have the reward of a very high profile. So some of the personal showcasing and personal benefits that we have seen in terms of impact, Rowan alluded to some of this. The fan mail that people get goes directly to the named academic. And some of them get very much, like hundreds, tens or hundreds of pieces of fan mail directly to them. And the name of the person who produced the podcast is the single most important piece of information with regard to discovery. So people search for material from people they've heard of, and they go for more material from people that they've listened to something. So series are very popular. And of course, if you get a hook, something, so our most popular stuff, the philosophy, building a business, quantum mechanics, Shakespeare, these are all series, and anything that is now put up by those people will very quickly go very high into the download charts. So there's something in these comments, first of all, about reward and recognition, that just feeling rewarded and recognized and getting feedback is sometimes missing from our day-to-day teaching. And it's a huge personal boost to receive feedback. but also that it links with their ethos of teaching. So particularly this, my work involves releasing previously secret documents. So for this academic, it's no challenge to think about making material open. And we also see impact in terms of changes in practice. Everyday teaching and learning practice is influenced by this, by the fact that they are working with podcasts. So there's something very do-it-yourself about this, and as I say, it would be very difficult for us to sustain such a huge growing area of activity if it wasn't for the fact that it's a kind of do-it-yourself activity at Oxford. Oxford is very devolved, and we have local support. The recordings are being made all around the institution. And I think that fits very well with the sort of Web 2 feeling, that it should be as easy to make podcasts and get them up into iTunes as you've heard, that it is easy to make podcasts at home and get it up. So actually the considerable investment which adds value in the centre, which is that it's easy for academics to send material to the centre and it magically appears very quickly up into iTunes. That's where a whole bunch of the investment went, but a lot of people don't particularly see that. But it's money well spent if it seems very easy, because we'll all know from any time spent working in learning technologies that if it's at all difficult to do in terms of for the academic, if it takes too much of their time, then they're unlikely to do it. What we do is we add at the centre the support for that sort of do-it-yourself approach, and it is our responsibility to make the material discoverable, listenable, to put it up where people can find it, to make sure that other people can search for it, to make sure that it's in the right format, to make sure that it's safely stored and archived and looked after, it's well organized, and to train people in the skills that they need to make this material for themselves. So for them, it doesn't seem like it's a huge operation. It seems like a single person. It's just me putting my stuff up, but centrally it's quite a big operation. So the need to get sort of buy-in to that activity, sustainability. We talk about how something is sustainable. In learning technology, we used to always talk about getting academic buy-in for something, and I think that's part of the sustainability. So the Creative Commons license has actually really helped us with that, because it's kind of cool. People had heard of it, they'd seen it in Flickr, and people want to be part of that gang, have that badge. So the license itself makes it possible to protect the material for the future to a certain extent, makes it more sustainable, because the community can adopt it and care for it. But also it can be translated into different languages, it can be used in lots of different places, so that actually makes it more valuable. So it increases its value. But for me, it actually is very helpful in recognizing teaching as a creative act. And the idea that the effort that you put into creating your material and the time you spend on the design of that is actually something that sounds a bit more like creativity rather than just a sort of a slog of what used to be called learning objects. So. The impact of the material outside the institution is a lot about the brand, where it's come from, and it being trusted, and who's looking at it. But our aim was to be aspirational. So, I couldn't have paid for this. Price's quote: "Our more able students are encouraged to listen to podcasts both to improve their understanding of the plays and to encourage them to believe that Oxford is not a rarefied and unattainable target, but operates at a level they will find accessible." So in terms of material that's aspirational, that's exactly what we were hoping for. I'll let you read this one. And what interests me about this one particularly is that although it's somebody who's saying that we're listening to the resources and we're suggesting to the students that they listen to them, what's also actually happening there is influence on pedagogy. The way that that subject is now being taught in that school is being influenced by what Emma does in her research and the way that she uses this example, and she's recommending this example. So whether or not the content is being reused, which of course it is, people are listening to it, but actually the ideas behind, the ideas in the material is actually influencing the pedagogy of the people who are teaching, not just that they're using podcasts in their teaching, but that they're teaching in a different way. And again, another example of somebody who teaches differently after having been inspired by listening to Oxford academics talk. If we're going to show impact, I would want to show impact that changes people's behaviour. So there's two quotes here. Open University is actually the Australian Open University. This is actually, the podcasts have inspired people to behave differently, to go back to study or to study more. And the Oxford students are actually a little less articulate. This is what they say. And this is important, the way lectures are organised at Oxford. You could easily miss them. They all run at the same time. They're organised at the timetable that suits the professor rather than the student, and it's very easy. Sometimes they only happen once. They're unique events, and you could hear about a lecture after it has passed and you didn't get to go, or it could clash with something else. So being able to time shift our lectures has been very important to the students on campus. It's also, I hope, modelling for them the fact that the professors that they work with are making material available in this way, and so as early career researchers, perhaps that becomes a behaviour that they recognise. And the much more articulate, older, lifelong learner outside the institution. Ultimately, I think that the value of the collection and the impact that it has is down to the brand, and we're very lucky to have such a strong brand. So, Oxford University Podcasts is a brand that you can trust. It won't shrink your woolens or rot your brain, and in fact, it perhaps will heal. Thank you very much. These are all images from the very wonderful John Johnson collection.
Another great JISC-funded digitisation. Again, I'm sure there are lots of questions, so just raise your hand and I'll run towards you.
Thank you. Thank you, that was really interesting. I suppose I was struck by those couple of comments by the students, and it reminded me of how we've always been told we've got to get our lectures up on the VLE and all that sort of thing. And clearly what's going on here is a sort of performative mode of dissemination. And I just wonder how much support there is for the lecturers who are clearly, world leaders in their field, but in terms of their ability to communicate through this medium, which is quite different, I would have thought. So it's not just the content, but it's actually about the way they're engaging with those who listen. Or is there any? Is there any sort of support or training for how they make their work available in that, on that platform?
Yes, we run a lot of training around training for podcasting. Yes, so the Learn Technologies group also hosts all the IT training for the institution, and the how to podcast, podcasting for educational purposes, presenting to an audience, presenting to camera, media training is all run through there. And I think that gets more and more popular, and I think that is in response to a feeling that the role of being an academic these days is having an online presence, and that looking good when you're doing that is very important. And a lot of the material is audio, and it's audio only for lots of very good reasons. And in fact, where there's a video version and an audio version available, the audio version still gets taken down, requested many more times, I think because people are listening to it on the bus or in the bath, that kind of stuff. But yeah, not everybody has wanted to go for video, perhaps because of the feeling that there's a requirement to perform even more so. But also a lot of the material that is very popular, and it sort of filters itself to the top because people like it and download it, is material that's taken from public events to a certain extent, visiting speakers, also alumni weekend where a variety of people speak about their material to a gathered audience that isn't just their small group of students. Within teaching with a small group within Oxford, obviously there's all of the support in how to be a lecturer and that kind of stuff. But what we are seeing is those little subtle changes in behaviours about knowing that there's a secondary audience for your material. So Emma says, I used to say, in the handout you'll see. She says, I've stopped saying that because people were writing to me asking for the handout, so she doesn't mention it in the audio. So there's little things like that. And also people choosing to perhaps chunk their material in slightly different ways. I think that's media literacy, perhaps, yeah.
Oh gosh, I'll go here and then I'll get it back and come back.
How did you gather all the encomia? Was that part of your impact measurement analysis, or was that simply unsolicited ad hoc?
People write to the lecturer directly, often because the presenter's name is so clearly on the material. And actually we didn't know at the centre that all of this fan mail was being received. It came as a bit of a surprise because although we're the technical channel that gets the material up, it wasn't actually until we bumped into some of those people and it's very endearing that actually the academics themselves didn't particularly, most of them didn't ask how many downloads they got. Or
having a kind of, if you'd like to respond, comment, press here?
It might be. I think we perhaps went in a little naively, not knowing what the response to the material was. I think it's important to think about the impact on the individual of making material available. And certainly when you talk to the MIT and Harvard academics who are a little bit further down the road of this, the impact of having to potentially support learners all over the world who are now interacting with your material might have been an arrangement you didn't really realize you were getting into. Your job is to support the students who are here. What's nice about OER is that the material can be taken and used by somebody else who might facilitate a discussion around it or create a course around it. And there are online courses being built out of material that is being made available through many of the OER projects. So it may not actually, and that's what's nice about open source and open material, is that other people can respond to questions about it, and the community can maintain, hopefully, certainly in things like Humbox, where the idea is that people from a subject community can respond and help learners around it. And the individual people writing to the letters that come to the individual are mostly thank yous. Thank you for making that material available, rather than questions about it, luckily, so far, mostly.
Hi. When the videotaping and recording of lectures was first being suggested 15 years ago or something, I know in other institutions lecturers were extremely concerned that having recorded a series of lectures, they would then be told, thank you, your services are no longer required. Now, it's fine at the moment because basically what you've been doing is cherry picking, but thinking about the suggestion from the student that all lectures be automatically recorded, I mean, you know, I might change institution, the podcast will remain here at Oxford, and, you know, will I be replaced? Those questions aren't going away, and perhaps the licensing needs to reflect some of those issues.
Yeah, I think those, as you say, those arguments have been around for a long time. I don't know that I'm necessarily in a position to start the mass recording of lectures across Oxford. I'm trying to think of the cabling that we would have to be doing for that. I think Oxford is immune to that kind of infrastructural change. But I think one of the other nice things, by the way, Oxford, what happens at Oxford is that, you know, there are many lectures that only happen once. And perhaps the lecturer does leave the institution, but the wonderfulness of what they were talking about when they were here means a lot to the study of what's going on here. And in the same way as we hold everything in the Bodleian, it doesn't mean that new stuff doesn't turn up in the Bodleian. We haven't got the knowledge all in there now, and we can lock it. And we can't stop employing librarians either, even though there's loads of books. We could stop. Now, I think that research-led teaching means that it changes every minute, and there will always be academics talking about the thing that they have just discovered, and their own teaching may change. And actually, for many of them, if you talk about books that have been published, and they say, I published that a year ago, and like about a month after I published that, I realized that that whole chapter isn't what I think now, and I can't go back and change that. And it's all, you know, authored and permanent. And actually, the academics who are here, who teach regularly, still record more things, and they talk about maybe different things this term and next term. And I don't know. I haven't seen people lying in gutters destitute because they made podcasts for Oxford.
Hi, I work in the communications team in the Economic and Social Research Council, and I was just a bit intrigued by the decision not to vet the research that is being presented as podcasts, because obviously it has a bearing on the brand of the university. So is it a sort of a shift in thinking of it rather as not as a media channel but as a research output, simply? See what I mean?
Okay, so vetting and quality. Okay, so to a certain extent, the quality is already assured by the quality of people who are employed by Oxford University. There has been some selection process applied there. The material is also signed off by that person and by their head of department. So and I do think that we have to respect and to a certain extent elevate academic practice. So there are some people who are doing some dodgy academic practice, but mostly people at Oxford understand their own content sufficiently that they wouldn't be putting out there material that it's their own reputation, really. This is a big institutional but individual reputation. And,
yes, sorry, I didn't mean the quality of the research. I meant merely kind of how interesting was it for the public, basically.
I didn't get where I am today telling Oxford academics whether their stuff is interesting or not.
Okay, I think we're going to leave it there on that wonderful note. Thank you very much for the presentation, and all our speakers, Jane Winter and Brian Kelly.